Hey everybody, welcome along. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining wherever you are in the world. I know that it's been a couple of weeks since I've done one of these and I apologise for that. It's just been really difficult. My life is crazy right now. I'm never in the same place for more than 5 minutes, which has made it very difficult to try and keep these things going on a regular basis. So what I'm going to try and commit to you to do is to do one of these after every Grand Prix, so the Monday after every race. If I can get any more done outside of that, I absolutely will. I just can't guarantee it. So let's try and leave it at that, and I'll do my very best. I can promise you that. Thank you to all of you saying hello. I appreciate that. Someone says, get the mic out of your nose. Okay. Yeah, it's moved a little bit over, hasn't it? Slightly different mic setup today, just because I was set up here after doing my podcast in this particular spot last night, and so I thought I'd use the same mic. Thank you to Alex Sadler, who says, great podcast today. I appreciate that, Alex. It was one of my favourite podcasts that I did, because I listened back to it as I was going through the sort of edit process or uploading it. One of my favourites. If you haven't yet checked out my Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast, please go and do so. It's in all of the podcast stores. And this week, it's kind of asking the question, who's the best F1 driver? Not on the surface level, but talking about how we ask that question, more importantly, how we answer that question. And as I always do in every one of my podcasts, what we can learn from the way we answer that type of question. And as well as that, I also kind of got quite vulnerable. I kind of put myself on the line in this week's podcast, sharing some of my biggest weaknesses, some of the things that I struggle with most in my life. And I put them into this week's podcast. So it was quite a difficult one for me to do. But when I came out the other side of it, I kind of felt refreshed, like I'd been through therapy. So listen, if you haven't yet listened to it, I please urge you to go and give it a go. That's number 29. So we're nearly 30 episodes in. So if you haven't yet found it at all in your life, I'd encourage you to go and search it out. Pit Lane Life Lessons. Anyway, we also had a Grand Prix yesterday, didn't we? And I was very lucky and fortunate to be commentating on the entire Grand Prix weekend for the BBC. Something that I'm very privileged and honoured to be able to do. I love doing it. It's an absolute honour to be able to commentate, communicate what's going on to the people that are not lucky enough to be there, but also to share my opinions and to generally delve really deep into a Grand Prix weekend for the purposes of doing a job. It's an amazing opportunity and I love it. So I was across every single lap that was run this weekend, and as a result I feel even more prepared to take on your questions and have some hopefully insightful answers. So we'll get to all of those as we go through the next hour. I definitely want to cover the whole idea of porpoising and what the FIA should do about that. I asked the question in the SeedStream app earlier on today. In fact, should we even start there? I'll start there in just a moment. I put a poll up inside the SeedStream F1 app, which is an app that me and two of my friends, colleagues, have created and developed over the last couple of years. It's still in development, but we're now moving much more closely to a sort of finalised version. Inside that app, I put a poll up, and the poll was asking what the FIA should do. So we've got lots of results from that now come in, and I'll get to those in a moment. We're going to talk about, obviously, Ferrari's disastrous weekend and what that means, not only for the championship right now in terms of the points, but what it could have a knock-on effect for later in the season, how Red Bull can be taking advantage of that, of course, and anything else that you want to talk about. So you fire your questions in. I'll do my best to answer them. That's the way it works. If you don't mind dropping me a little like at some point through the video, if you do enjoy it, I'd appreciate that too. So let's start. And I want to start, actually, I've missed the question. It's all disappeared now. Here's a question. Well, God, I've lost it again. Sorry. Okay, I think we're going to start with the porpoising, because that was the question. Let's start with the whole porpoising thing, right? It's become a massive talking point, particularly over this weekend. It's been a talking point right since the very start, the very launch of these cars. But this weekend, I guess it kind of became worse because the cars were going along the longest straight that we see in the F1 calendar, highest speeds that we see on a bumpy street circuit as well. And that was the kind of perfect storm for this bouncing effect that the 2022 cars are suffering with to just become worse and more extreme and for longer. So lots of talk around it off the back of that, a lot of it coming from Mercedes. And you will have seen Lewis Hamilton, you'll have heard him complaining about it in the car, but also afterwards outside of the car. You'd have seen him getting out of the car very gingerly, clearly suffering quite a lot. And it's not surprising when you see the onboard footage from some of these cars, just how violently they're bouncing down the straight. The question, though, is what should be done about it? Should anything be done about it from an FIA perspective, or is it just up to the teams? And I'd love to know your opinions on this. I do fire in your thoughts on this. Let me see. When Mercedes was dominant, F1 was bad. Now with Max, it's more alive. So to do that, you must be great. So for me, Max will be the GOAT. Okay, sorry, slightly off topic that one. I didn't read it before I said it. Right. What are you saying about Mercedes? Lots of you loving the commentary over the weekend, so thank you very much for that. Lots of you loving the fact that I'm also the F1 engineer, the race engineer in the new F1 game. So thank you to Dan Macchio for that. Big up you. Right, yes, I am also in the laundry room. I mean, I say the laundry room, I'm in the middle of my, I should explain, I'm in the middle of my house, which is under massive renovation, still will be for the next few months. So that's why it's a bit of a building site in the background. Right, let's jump straight in. I'll give you my thoughts on the whole Mercedes situation, okay? Because, look, there's two issues here. One is the health and safety of the drivers. Now, clearly, Lewis, and not only Lewis, but other drivers as well, were suffering to some reasonably serious extent. Lewis took on some physical pain, of course, in terms of back pain, struggled his way around the racetrack. Others are talking about blurred vision, struggling to see braking points, headaches that come from the back of it, nerve damage, potential muscle strains as they get out of the car. Now, some of these things are part and parcel of going through a Grand Prix. It's a tough sport. It's a physical sport. You're not going to feel fresh as a daisy when you get out of a car after 51 laps of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix circuit. However, we need to, I think, have a little look into exactly what the longer term impacts of this might be, health impacts might be on a driver. So that's that side of it. We can't just ignore the fact that drivers may be, and I use that word deliberately, they may be doing long-term damage to themselves. We shouldn't be allowing that in the sport. The question then is, what do we do about it? Whose responsibility is it, and what should be done, what could be done to make sure that the drivers remain safe and healthy whilst entertaining us in the Grand Prix cars? And thank you for your comments. I will get to them in a moment. And that was the very question that I put to the poll of the SeedStream users in today's in the app today. So I'm just going to read you the results out of that to show you what the general opinion was there. The question in the poll was, how should the FIA deal with porpoising? Simple as that. But then we had three answers. One was, leave the rules as they are. It would be unfair to essentially penalise the teams which are less affected. Second answer was, make immediate changes to the technical regulations. Drivers shouldn't have to choose between health and performance. And the third answer was, make changes but wait until 2023 to introduce them. Now, the overwhelmingly most popular answer to that was the first one. Leave the rules alone. Leave them as they are. It would be unfair to essentially penalise the teams which are less affected. 57% of people saying that. 23% of people saying, make immediate changes. We've just got to fix this. We can't compromise driver safety. And 20% of people saying, make changes, but wait until 2023 to introduce them. So most people saying, we should just leave it alone. And to some extent, I actually agree with that. I think we should leave it alone, in that I don't think the FIA should step in to have to make mandate changes in terms of creating a rule, for example, that says we have to have a minimum ride height, which has to be higher than the teams are running right now to eliminate the bouncing effect. What I don't think, or what I do think rather, is that this is the responsibility in the most part of the teams. And I'll clarify what I mean by that, because there is a very simple fix to this bouncing effect. The teams could all jack their rear ride height up. That would stop the cars running quite so low to the tarmac. They wouldn't bounce along the surface at the speeds that they're going, particularly around a circuit like in Baku. And the bouncing effect would be minimised. but the cars would go slower around the lap. They'd compromise performance in doing that. So no team, and even most of the drivers, don't want to do that. Of course, there's a trade-off and there's a balance. There's a compromise somewhere in the middle where you have to find a sweet spot that is okay and comfortable enough for the drivers to sustain their performance around the lap, but doesn't compromise the overall lap time from a car and technical perspective. And I would equate this to something like the downforce versus drag penalty. You know, you want downforce and grip as you go around a racetrack. And so it would be very easy to pile on loads of downforce, big wings that would force the car down into the racetrack, give you so much grip through the corners. But it comes with a drag penalty. That drag penalty costs you performance. It slows the car down, and so you don't want that. So what you have to do is you have to back off that downforce. You have to take less downforce than you really want. You might introduce a bit of sliding. You give the drivers a bit more of a challenge through the corners because they haven't got the downforce to generate the grip. But you increase your top speed around the long straight parts of any given circuit. It's a trade-off. And that's the same with everything in Formula One. It's a trade-off. It always is a trade-off. And the teams have to find the right balance to suit their car and their setup for any particular given circuit. And for me, this should be no different. Yes, we could introduce rules that say there should be a maximum amount of vertical G loading that should be sustained by a driver, and you could easily monitor that with sensors inside the cockpit. And if a car or a driver or a team exceeds that minimum G-force loading, that vertical movement with an accelerometer, they get penalised. It's very easy to introduce if you wanted to do that. But actually, if the drivers inside a team, and let's take Mercedes as the example, because they seem to be the most vocal of the drivers, it seems to be the car and the team that have the biggest problem with this, the team can fix that. Now, if you're Red Bull looking at this, who don't have anywhere near the same problem, yet still have a very fast car, essentially what they've done is they've come up with a better solution to the 2022 regulations that give them performance and don't introduce this kind of problem. That's brilliant stuff from Red Bull. That's some kind of failure from the perspective of Mercedes. Now, in previous years, you'd say, look, just go and redesign your car. But we're under a tight budget cap now, which makes that incredibly difficult. And that is why, or at least one of the reasons why, Mercedes are very vocal, really pushing the FIA to try and step in and introduce a rule change that might alleviate this problem that Mercedes, and not just Mercedes, as I said, others are suffering with. So, look, that's my take on it. Let me see what you guys are saying here. Joel Leffers says, agree with option 1. It's up to the teams to fix their cars, not the FIA. Let me see. Maximum vertical G, says Lee Nux. Yeah, definitely could do that. I hate to say it, but half of the grid got it right. Marc are but hurt. That's their problem. I hate to say this. I think a lot of you are saying that. That's come from McLaren F1 race. Let me see. 18 drivers complaining. It was Ross Brawn that got it wrong, says FIA Mia Hamm. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as you've got the word ham in your name. Look, did the FIA or did Formula One get it wrong in coming up with a rules concept for 2022 that utilises underfloor aerodynamics? I don't think they did. They did all that for very good reasons, and in some cases we've seen improvements in the racing because of what we have done with the 2022 cars. The teams are very clever. They know that underfloor aerodynamics are subject to the car running very close to the floor to maximise that downforce, but is it any different to the drag versus downforce compromise that I just gave an example of earlier? Why is it any different? You know, you're talking about the human being part rather than losing out on top speed. You're talking about losing out on driver comfort by running the car too low, not losing out on top speed as you would by piling on more and more downforce. The compromise in this situation is driver comfort, potentially even driver health. So as a team, should that not even be higher up your priority to find the best solution that works for you? Of course, I completely get it. No one wants to compromise performance, particularly Mercedes, who find themselves struggling this year anyway with performance. The very last thing they want to be able to, or be forced to do, is to compromise their car even more. But of course, if their drivers are complaining the way they are, if they're suffering the way they are, perhaps they're going to have to do something. Let me see. Right. What if some driver passes out and has a huge crash, or a huge crash happens? That would be absolutely terrible, wouldn't it? But would that not be the same if a particular car was running a cooling package, for example, that made the cockpit of the car so hot, but that was seen as the best way of doing it? Perhaps they managed to put radiators, as an extreme example. This will never happen, but let's just say they found a way to put the radiators inside the cockpit of the car. And that meant they could maybe shave down the side pods, they could minimize drag, they could save, increase aerodynamic performance by putting the radiators in the car. But in doing so, the drivers get so hot that they're on the brink of passing out. Now, you might shout at your screen and say, that's stupid, no one's going to do that. Of course they're not going to do that, but isn't it the same thing? If putting the radiators in the cockpit offered a substantial performance enhancement, would a team ever be tempted to start looking into that option? You can't do it within the rules. I'm just using it as a sort of theoretical example. But why is that any different? And if a driver then got so hot he passed out, whose fault would it be? Would it be the fault of the rules, or would it be the fault of the teams? Would you have to make a rule to stop that happening? Or should you say to the teams, you've got to look after the health and well-being of your own driver? Now, I'm not saying which is right, because actually, having just explained that example, I can see an argument where the FIA would step in that situation and say, look, we're going to ban radiators from the cockpit. It has no advantage other than being dangerous, or it has no major impact other than being dangerous. And maybe this is a similar thing, but I just don't see it in quite the same way. I think it's an issue that many of the teams have got around. They have designed their car around, or at least they've set up their car to get around this problem. Mercedes are having to push the envelope to the extreme level in terms of running their car low and stiff to get the performance. And this is the effect. This is the knock-on compromise effect they're having. It's their drivers, their own drivers, who are suffering as a result of the team pushing the limits of performance. So when you say it like that, it sort of feels like the team have to back off their performance. Yes, they may well take some serious result hits in terms of the Grand Prix coming up. But if that's what you've got to do to keep your drivers safe and healthy, maybe that's what you've got to do. Would bringing back active suspension help? So a lot of people have asked this kind of question, and thank you for that one. Who said it? Sorry, I've lost your name. But would bringing back active suspension help? Lotus 98. Thank you. So in theory, yes. What you could do if you had, because if you got active suspension, and I'm talking about active suspension in the modernised form of what we had back in the olden days, where you can independently, completely control the attitude, the ride height, the pitch and dive, everything to do with the car suspension. Yes, then you have it completely under control. So what you can do in that scenario, of course, is maintain that perfect ride height that you need. Now, it may be that you have to set that slightly higher. It can't react at the frequency that the car's hitting the bumps at that sort of speed. It can't counteract every one of those bumps at that frequency. I'm pretty sure we don't have hydraulic actuators that are able to work at that speed under that much load. But what you can do is you can maintain a ride height. You can set a ride height or a minimum ride height for the car. You can keep the car level going around corners, going over bumps. There's all sorts of things you can do with active ride height that would absolutely be one route to eliminating this problem. However, of course, that's incredibly difficult to introduce in the short term. It's a completely different car. It's a completely different Formula One if we go down that route. Now, I'm not against it. I love that kind of technology advancement, but it's a completely different Formula One. And for me, that shouldn't be a fix to the bouncing or porpoising effect. If we wanted to introduce active suspension, we should introduce it on the grounds that it's a great technology that we could develop. It could be transferred to the road car industry. The learnings that we take from it can be passed on. Those should be the motivating forces for me, not as a sort of band-aid fix for the current problems that we have. Or make it softer on the straights, says Chris. Absolutely. So you can change the dynamics of the suspension so that it's not running quite as stiff as you go down the straights. You could set your ride height, but allow the ride to be a little bit more compliant. There's all sorts of things. It's infinitely adjustable on the move, and that's the beauty of it. Right. Checo said to George that my leg's gone numb. Okay. I mean, look, Formula One cars are brutal things, and they put them on a very sort of bumpy street circuit. They are going to be brutal. I'm not sure that is necessarily a kind of function of this bouncing effect. If you look at the Red Bull, I think Sky did quite a good analysis of this over the weekend. The Red Bull runs reasonably higher than the Mercedes, and even with a little bit of rake in the car, I think, to some extent. And they found a way to run the car like that and generates, amazing performance. Look, they have one of the fastest cars on the grid, a lot faster than the Mercedes. But the way the Mercedes works, they have to run it as low as possible. So it's a design function of the Mercedes. I know lots of people have this effect, and some are suffering. And in Baku, as I said, for all the reasons I talked about at the start, it's a more extreme version of what we've seen at other racetracks. But because Mercedes have always been worse, of course, when you take that effect to the extreme, Mercedes were always going to suffer more than everybody else in those circumstances as well. All right. Shall we move on from this one? Karun Chandok showed that Mercedes was driving on a lower ride height than Red Bull. So Carola Rue says that. Yeah, absolutely, I saw that. So they're having to run their car very low because that's where the performance lies with that particular car. And look, this is the first year of the 2022 regulations. Let's not forget that. Everybody's taken a slightly different interpretation. They've all looked for performance in slightly different ways. And that, I think, is really interesting. Even the fastest two cars on the grid, where there's almost nothing between them, the Red Bull and the Ferrari, in most circumstances, deliver their lap times in completely different ways. And I love all of this. I love that we've got a mix of different aero designs up and down the grid. The problem is that under this cost-capped regime that we're in right now, it's very difficult for a team to switch strategy, to switch concept partway through a season. Something that we could have done in years gone by. And of course it takes a long lead time, takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of money, but that's one of the biggest problems, that they can't just back off this. They can't just go back to a previous iteration because there isn't really one. I know they had a different car at their first pre-season test, but that was really just a very, very much an interim car. All of the focus has been on this particular iteration of the car for months now, so it's not just a quick fix to change it. Okay, so how does Newey get the wheelbarrow concept to work? I must admit, I haven't seen Newey, the wheelbarrow concept, so the high rake car where the front end is much lower than the back end. It's something that Red Bull have kind of, I want to say pioneered, it might not be the right word, but they've certainly taken to extremes over the last few years. It's one of the things, and we should get into, let's move over to sort of Red Bull territory now. It's one of the things that Max Verstappen has been able to maximise through his driving style, a car that's kind of very much on the nose. Because what happens is when you jack up the rear of the car, when you give it that high rake, you also lower the front end of the car. So everyone talks about the rear end of that Red Bull in previous years as being really high and maximising the efficiency of the diffuser, the underfloor. It absolutely does all of those things, but because the front wing is ahead of the pivot point, which is the axle line, it tips the front end down. And what that does is run the front wing incredibly close to the racetrack. You'll get that ground effect performance, that increased performance that comes with running an aero surface in close proximity to the ground at the front wing. You accelerate airflow like the cars are doing today all across the underside. They were doing that on that front wing, and that was giving a brilliantly strong front end. It was giving a sort of oversteery car rather than an understeery car. And yet this year in 2022, the best way to run these cars has been deemed to be much flatter than we've had in previous years. So you've not seen anyone with that extreme high rake, and everyone now running much closer to the tarmac and much flatter in terms of their attitude of the car. Now that has meant that the Red Bull in particular has had a much more understeery car. The 2022 cars in general are a little bit more understeery than they were in previous years, and Max doesn't seem perfectly comfortable with that. He prefers a car that's very much on the nose, that's got a strong front end, and he's able to deal with a looser rear end with his own driving style. This year it hasn't got that, and so I think Red Bull are now trying to work out ways whether they can or how they can tweak the setup, even potentially tweak the design as we go through upgrade phases of their 2022 car to just introduce that pointy driving dynamic that Max has become so used to over recent years. I mean, on the flip side of Red Bull, of course, they've got Checo, who has suddenly found himself very comfortable with the way the 2022 car works. So it's going to be interesting. They will, of course, try to find a way to get Max more comfortable in the car. And it may be that just introducing a little bit of rake in that car might go some way to bringing that kind of phenomenon back. But it's early days in that kind of development, I think, and only time will tell if they can manage to make it work. And, of course, on the flip side, what will be the effect on Checo? Will Red Bull let Perez race Max, says The Wall. Well, I think we kind of got that answer yesterday, didn't we? We've had that answer in Barcelona. We got it again yesterday. In Monaco, it was slightly different because it wasn't really possible to switch those two cars around because they had a Ferrari in between them. They were on slightly different strategies. They were certainly on different parts of the racetrack. And given the nature of Monaco, it certainly wasn't as easy to switch them around as it would be at any other racetrack. But we saw it yesterday. We saw Checo being asked not to fight as Max came through. Now, it wasn't the obvious get out of the way, our main man's coming through, but it was pretty much that. So that's maybe a sign and perhaps goes some way to answering your question there, The Wall. I hope they let Checo race Max at certain points in the season. Checo seems very comfortable in that car, and it would be remiss of them to write him off at this stage, given that at times Max hasn't been quite as comfortable. Only time will tell, and we'll keep a close eye on it for sure. Right, now the car has changed. Can Checo challenge Max? Well, I think he can challenge Max in terms of performance. We've seen that at a couple of racetracks now. I mean, having a new contract in your back pocket definitely helps. There's an episode of my podcast from last week on driver psychology and how it can impact performance. So go and check that one out. But that may be what's happening here. We've seen Checo from Monaco, of course, blitz that weekend. Again this weekend, he was the stronger of the two Red Bull drivers all the way through until the race. When it came to the race, he suffered with tyre deg, which is very un-Checo-like, and it was Max that actually seemed more comfortable in race trim. So there's no way we can write Max Verstappen off. No one's going to be silly enough to do that. But we have got two Red Bull drivers who on different days will have the stronger of the two performances, and the team are going to have a challenge to kind of manage that, or you'd think they'd have a challenge to manage that, unless they set their stall out now, which perhaps is what they're doing, and declare one of them a number one driver, one of them a number two driver, and everybody knows where they stand. But it's a tricky game to play, not one that I'm sure Checo will just take lying down. Right, what's your view on Joss butting into Red Bull politics and being vocal in the F1 circles? I never like to see not just a driver's dad, but actually anybody representing a driver to chirp in when it comes to team dynamics, team operations. Let the team get on with their job. It's what the team are very good at. Look, we know that Red Bull have been incredibly good over recent times at getting strategy right, at getting pit stops right. And just because it didn't quite go Max's way, of course it felt like sour grapes. What Jos Verstappen came out and said, I think it came out on the Max Verstappen official website. So, yeah, I don't like to hear it, I don't like to see it, but I also get the frustration. And also, it could have come out from a number of conversations that we weren't party to. There may have been conversations with Jos and, for example, Helmut Marko that says absolutely Max will always get number one status. We haven't heard that publicly, but maybe those conversations have happened, and therefore if that sort of thing has happened, you can understand why Jos might suddenly start to get upset. I'm speculating massively because I've got no idea, but we have to take these things with a slight pinch of salt because we don't know the full story. Right. Same with the Strolls and the Mazepins. Well, to some extent. And look, I can appreciate as a dad, I'm sure many of you who are dads or parents out there, I'm sure you can appreciate that if your son or daughter is seemingly struggling or seemingly not getting the best opportunities, if that's how it feels, if that's how it seems, if you know something on the inside that you seem or you see as being unfair, and yet you don't see that being portrayed in the media, you might want to get it out there. You feel like you have to defend your own child by sharing the story that you believe to be true. So I kind of get that. I get that defensive position that drivers, parents often take in these scenarios. It's just that from a team perspective, and having been on the inside of a team, I obviously can understand, or I get why that's really frustrating when, in the most part, the team are just trying to do their job. They're very good at doing their job, and they kind of just need to be left alone to get on with it. Right, let's have a quick look. Excuse me. Right, what is going on with Ferrari? I guess we should get onto the Ferrari question, shouldn't we? We have to cover it. Disaster, absolute disaster for Ferrari. They've had two disappointing weekends now in terms of Ferrari. Monaco, although they finished, second and fourth. For me, that goes down as pretty much a disaster, given that they started on the front row in Monaco. Now, if you start on the front row in Monaco, you should come away with a 1-2 result as a team, barring any engine blow-ups, barring crashes, anything like that. They didn't have any of those things. They kind of destroyed their own race. They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in Monaco, and that's a brutal blow. So they needed to come back. And actually, having followed them all weekend through my commentary duties with the BBC, I watched Ferrari start off on the back foot in Baku, start off a definite second best to Red Bull, but then work really hard all weekend from an engineering perspective, from a driver perspective, to tweak the setup, to adapt their car, to minimise the deficit that they were suffering to the Red Bulls, particularly in that final sector along the very long start-finish straight. Just minimise the deficit in terms of top speed. And they did that by lowering the downforce and therefore the drag penalty that came with it, but not compromising too much their performance through the tight twisty bits of sectors 1 and 2. So it was a real strong weekend from that sort of perspective. They faced adversity at the start of the weekend. They grouped together, they fought hard, they worked hard, and they kind of overcame a lot of that as the race weekend went on. Of course, they snatched a brilliant pole position, which was justification for that. But what Ferrari haven't yet been able to do is convert these pole positions into consistent race wins, and you are never going to win a championship unless you can do that. Part of it comes down to the inherent characteristics of their car compared to those of the Red Bull, which is a more raceable car. It's a faster car in a straight line, and that, quite frankly, is where most of the overtaking is done. On race day, that really pays dividends. And given that they're not much off Red Bull in terms of overall lap time pace, even if they're fractions behind on a Saturday, they can make it count on a Sunday. But even bigger than all of that, Ferrari are creating their own problems. They've got strategic errors creeping in. They had a number of problems last time out in Monaco. They've had problems with driver errors at times as well. But this time out is all about reliability. And it was a serious reliability concern, I think. The engine blow-up for Charles Leclerc was a good old-fashioned one. It was a proper one. You would imagine that is highly unlikely to be recoverable, that engine. When it goes at that speed and mechanical bits start hitting each other, it's very unlikely that it's going to survive, or certainly not that all the components are going to survive. And therefore, they've got to start introducing new bits into the system. But the problem they've got is, which new bits do you bring in? Do you just bring in more of the same? Or do you kind of try and wait and come up with a fix? We've got a race that's happening in less than a week's time in Canada, which is another high-speed circuit where the engines will be under major stress again, potentially introducing more and more of the same kind of problems for them. And if they bring in a new spec of engine now, as in a fix, new components, those components are then locked in. you can bring replacement parts. You can change the spec of your engine. Don't forget, the spec of an engine is locked now, in the most part. A couple of elements of the energy recovery system that you are still free and open to change until the 1st of September. But in the most part, the entire power unit is locked in place now from the 1st of March right through the next couple of years. So you can bring updates to your engine if it's on reliability grounds. Now, of course, Ferrari have a major reliability problem, so they can come up with a fix, they can design one, they can manufacture one, and they can introduce that without taking an extra penalty for breaking that particular rule. They'll take a penalty for bringing extra engines into the system, of course, but they're allowed to bring an upgrade in terms of bringing a new spec of engine on reliability grounds. The problem they've got is that, first of all, they've got to design and make a fix, and they haven't got very long to do that. That's the first challenge, and that's a significant one. Secondly, whenever they do that, if they find a new way of bringing a new component, new materials, new design, whatever it might be, you can only introduce that on engines that come into the system from that point on. You can't go back and retrospectively change all of your other engines that are in the pool. So they can't use any previous engines that they use with the old spec of components. They can't replace those engines. So they might be stuck with an engine in Canada that might be of the old spec, of which they know has a problem because they haven't been able to introduce a new upgraded part in that short time frame. That's a disaster for Ferrari. I don't know what the answer to it is. I'm sure they don't either. And probably they're just going to take penalty hits later in the season, and there might be nothing they can do about it. It kind of is a real serious problem, one that I'm not sure anyone knows what the fix is at this stage. There'll be frantic conversations happening at Maranello to try and get to the bottom of it, but there's no easy answer to it as far as I can see. Let's see what you're saying. Ferrari will have to turn down their PU for the rest of the season. It may well be that that's the only option that they have, to either reduce the mileage limit or to turn down the performance levels to a level that they think may not introduce the same problem. But of course, in doing so, they kind of hand the championship, if they haven't already, to Red Bull, who have no other threat. Other than the Ferraris, there is no other challenge to Red Bull. There's such a gulf behind the top two teams in terms of performance. If you take one of those teams out of the picture, like we saw yesterday, there is no challenge to Max Verstappen and Checo Perez. They will literally cruise to victory for the rest of the season if that's the case, if that's the fix that Ferrari have to bring in. Binotto is not delivering and maybe should go. DNF reliability and engine fails are mostly a thing of the past. So let's talk about the engine fails and reliability being a thing of the past. It has been a thing of the past because we've had very little in the way of engine upgrades over the last couple of years. Certainly not under the time pressures that we've had coming into this season. Because we have locked down the hardware in Formula One in terms of power units, there was a deadline by which everybody had to bring their best performance to the car, because that's now fixed right through to the end of 2025 or even beyond. So the teams had to potentially even take risks in terms of getting maximum performance, because the one thing the rules allowed you to do was make changes on reliability grounds. So if your engine blows up, okay, so you can redesign a component and fix the reliability problems. What you can't do is bring anything that might help with performance. So you had to go all out in terms of designing the most powerful engine you could bring, the best performance you could get by the 1st of March, even if it wasn't necessarily 100% reliable, because that was the element you could fix. And it may be that that's exactly the route that Ferrari took. I don't know the answer to that, but that is something that a challenge that all the teams were faced with. Now, when it comes to Binotto, I mean, yes, there has to be questions being asked, not just about this reliability problem, but about Ferrari's longer-term problem of not being able to deliver championships. And in 2022, look, there's a huge caveat. New cars, budget caps, all of these things that are new to everybody, it would be very difficult to judge any team too harshly on what's been delivered in 2022. But I don't think that's the real picture at Ferrari. The bigger picture at Ferrari is they haven't managed to deliver a championship since Kimi Räikkönen in 2007. And that is a team that probably had the biggest budget of anybody on the grid for many of those years. They had almost any driver available to them. They could select and pick and choose who came to work for them, who drove their cars. They could spend almost any amount of money on designing and creating the best cars that they could, and yet they still haven't been able to deliver that ultimate prize. That's got to hurt for everybody, the Tifosi, everybody at Ferrari. And ultimately, when your organisation fails consistently over such a long period of time, it quite often falls on the person at the top of that tree to take the hit for that, to take the blame for that, or if not the blame, the responsibility for it. And I'm quite frankly amazed that Ferrari haven't taken that viewpoint. Now, I never want to see somebody getting sacked. I think Binotto has a lot to offer. If you talk to people in and around Ferrari, a lot of people have respect for him. He has been there a long time. He knows the Ferrari way. And that was one of the things that I think they needed. Somebody with some Ferrari consistency. But if they cannot deliver, if they consistently can't deliver, well, then something has to change. They can't continue to go down the same path year on year out, failing over and over again. So I would not be surprised if questions start being asked, more serious questions, more difficult questions for the management at Ferrari to start answering, because it's starting to look, and it is very early in the season, Ferrari could easily turn this down. They've got a very fast car. They've got two very good drivers. And yet, once again, they are seemingly letting themselves down. And that just won't cut it with the Ferrari board. It won't cut it for very much longer with the Ferrari fan base either. And so, perhaps they've got to start looking at doing a few things differently. What was your thoughts on the FIA president saying that drivers shouldn't voice their views? So the FIA president, you may have seen this, I thought shot himself in the foot, quite frankly, by saying that drivers, I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but his views were something along the lines of, I wouldn't have shared my opinions or my views on those subjects if I was in your position. Essentially saying that Formula One drivers, well, they're Formula One drivers, they're not political proponents, they shouldn't be sharing those kind of views with the world. He then sort of backtracked a little bit on Twitter, but quite frankly, the FIA as a whole have not covered themselves in glitter in recent times, have they? The teams are unhappy with them. F1 seems somewhat unhappy with them. The drivers seem unhappy. The fans are unhappy. Communication to the media from the FIA hasn't been good either, so the media are reasonably unhappy. So off the back of a massive investigation after an absolute mess in Abu Dhabi at the end of last season, they needed to come out in 2022 the most clean cut, the most polished, with the best communication, simplifying as much as they could, making sure that it's a transparent organisation, and none of those things seem to have happened yet. And the comments from the president last week, I just thought were the icing on the cake. So a lot of work to do, a lot of questions being asked there as well, and actually some stories bubbling away in the background, one of which I touched on in my podcast again a couple of weeks ago, around how F1 are even looking at trying to find a way to get the FIA to step back from the running of this sport, to allow F1 themselves to take over all of the running, hoping that the FIA can be there in a symbolic fashion, but actually step away from any decision-making, any rule-making, anything that actually affects the running of the sport, and leaving that to Formula One. That's a story that's been bubbling away for quite some time now, hasn't yet really grasped hold because the races are coming thick and fast, but those are conversations that are happening amongst the stakeholders and a storyline that may well surface to a greater extent at some point in the not too distant future. Right. Kyalami could be a reality. Yes, it could. Lots of stories bubbling up today about a sort of South African Grand Prix emerging on the calendar, so keep an eye on that one. Let me see. The FIA is an embarrassment, if I'm honest, says Jason. We need to talk about Sebastian Vettel. Yeah, let's talk about Sebastian Vettel. I gave him my driver of the day yesterday, and you might disagree with that, and you're welcome to. There were a number of drivers that drove really solid races. Max Verstappen, of course, drove a great race, but he didn't have much to do in terms of challenge. George Russell drove a really solid race, but again, had no challenge behind him and very little he could do in front of him, so it's a very lonely race. I thought Pierre Gasly did really well. Checo, of course, did well. There were a number of really solid drivers. But I thought Sebastian Vettel was good because he had his elbows out again. He was racy. And he made a mistake, didn't he? In one of his later overtake attempts, he made a mistake and went down an escape road. And you could argue that he shouldn't have a Driver of the Day award because of that. But I love to see what seemed like almost the old Sebastian Vettel back. He was just getting feisty again on the racetrack. And that's what I love. He went for a number of wheel-to-wheel moves, overtakes, a bit of aggression coming from him again. It feels like he's got his mojo back. He is being a little bit outspoken. He's doing a lot more media stuff. He's getting his message out there. He seems like a guy who's loving what he's doing, who is embracing his role as a Formula One driver again, where he's sort of disappeared into his shell to some extent. He's delivering some reasonable results in a difficult car for that team, and I'm really pleased to see that. I like the guy, and I love the fact that he's seemingly on the up again. So there you go. That's my take on Sebastian Vettel. If anyone has another opinion on that, let me know it. But I thought it was great. Vettel was my driver of the day yesterday as well, says Corolla. Do you reckon that Oscar Piastri will go to Williams? So big rumours circulating around that. That Williams seat, the second Williams seat, the seat that currently Latifi occupies. I mean, I don't know how, this must be awful for Nicholas Latifi, but he hasn't performed well enough, and this is what happens at the top level of sport. But there are lots of rumours about people replacing him. First of all, there were rumours around Nick de Vries. So that's Mercedes' reserve driver or simulator driver who stepped in, if you remember, a couple of races ago in Barcelona to do the Friday practice running in FP1 in the Williams. So Mercedes loaned him to Williams or asked Williams to run him in FP1. That was the first sign that something might be up, that those kind of conversations might be happening, that maybe Mercedes would place Nick de Vries in at Williams, of course a Mercedes customer team at the moment, to potentially replace Latifi because the team are clearly not happy with what he's able to do in the car. Now that would make some sense. They're a Mercedes customer, engine customer. It would be a nice, easy, seamless loan move, if you like, switcheroo. It could easily happen. But now there's talk about Oscar Piastri, a young driver that there is so much excitement around. I can't remember another driver in recent history, a young driver with no F1 experience, that has this much excitement around him. I really would love to see him in Formula One. He's currently a Renault contracted driver, and so that makes these rumours even more interesting, that the latest rumour is that potentially Piastri could be in that seat at Williams, the Latifi seat, before the summer break. Now that would of course mean a Renault driver going to a Williams-powered team. Slightly strange, but of course it might have larger implications further down the line. Potentially that's a hint to a Williams organisation doing a deal with Renault for a future season where they then take on Renault power units. It could well be. Renault don't have any customer teams right now. It would make a lot of sense for them to do it. It works on so many levels. It gets their young driver in an F1 car, starting to build experience. It gets their engines into a customer team that doubles the amount of data they can start recovering from every Grand Prix weekend. And it gives Williams an incredibly strong driver lineup on the face of it. A young guy who everybody's desperate to see what they can do, and an Alex Albon who everybody seems to rate very highly and actually is doing a pretty good job for them. So it could be transformational for the Williams team that at the moment are really struggling to do anything. So that is one to keep an eye on, and quite an exciting move, I think, if it happens. So, is the cost cap hindering Mercedes' effort to fix the porpoising? Absolutely. The cost cap is hindering anybody's efforts to fix any problems they have with their car. And that includes when the drivers stick it into a wall and bend it. The crash repairs just have to come out of your budget for the season. So, of course, you'll have a portion of your budget at the start of the year put away for crash damage. And you would imagine that at the top teams, you expect less crashes than maybe the teams at the back that have rookie drivers. And you're in the middle of the pack, in the most part, much more likely to have an accident. Teams like Haas have had an enormous repair bill this season. And that absolutely directly takes away from any budget that you might otherwise assign to development of the car. So, yes, absolutely. If you've got a problem with your car in terms of how it works, how its dynamics are operating on the racetrack, how its aerodynamics are working, if you've got a problem like Mercedes have, to fix it, you'd have to take money out of your development budget. Now, of course, you can argue that is exactly what development is. It's trying to fix problems and make the car better. But what they're trying to do is fight fires. They're not looking for outright performance, although they go hand in hand. They are trying to prevent a sort of inherent weakness in the car rather than looking for further and further strengths, which is what they've become used to over the last few years. So it's a tricky situation, but I think, unfortunately, one they've got to probably just kind of suck up. Right, so hold on. Where else are we going here? Piastri can only disappoint. The hype around him is so much. Still hope he succeeds, though, says Richard Boone. It's a good point. When a young driver has this much hype around them, you got to hope they deliver. Because if they don't, it can be a dramatic fall. And not only a fall in terms of how people react to you in the car, but how that impacts then on your psychology, on your mindset, on your mood, and how that can then in turn affect your performance, and your career can actually be over before it's even begun. I don't think that's going to happen. I think he is going to deliver. He's delivered in every opportunity that he's had so far, and I expect that would continue. Does the Alpine have any potential? Alonso seems to put in some fast drives lately. The Alpine does have potential, but it seems inconsistent. And what we saw yesterday in Baku was a car that couldn't really deliver the fastest lap time. It was a number of occasions during the race where it was the cork in the bottle, wasn't it? Both of their drivers had huge trains behind them because their lap time wasn't the fastest, but they had an incredibly fast car down the straight. Now, that's a good option when it comes to race day because you know it's much harder to be overtaken. But that works on a circuit like Baku. It may work in Canada as well. But at other tracks, you know, you need a different thing. You need a different characteristic of your car. So if they can tweak it to bring that characteristic, then great. But we haven't seen that on a consistent enough basis yet. But they maximised the strengths of their car yesterday, and I thought they did a pretty good job. Alonso is on form at times and doing a pretty good job in that car. So I wouldn't write it off. It's just it's inconsistent, or it's very racetrack dependent whether or not they have performance. Right, we've got 5 or so minutes, 6-7 minutes left. Hold on. Cheers. Right, McLaren have not been porpoising. Why are they so slow again compared to the front runners? McLaren, I thought actually had a reasonable day yesterday in race trim. It's just that they struggled so much in qualifying, they didn't really maximise the result. But actually, Daniel Ricciardo was on form yesterday, I thought. They went on a slightly different strategy to most people over the entire weekend, in that they did a lot of running on the hard tyres on Friday, whereas almost nobody else did. And of course, the hard tyre came into play on race day. Daniel Ricciardo even starting on that tyre, given the information they had. And it was a strategy that kind of worked for him to some extent until he got held up by his teammate Lando Norris. So the one thing I wonder at McLaren, and we talked about this in the BBC podcast that we recorded after the race yesterday, is I just wonder if that driver pairing has almost run its course in terms of not only the disappointing performances that we've had from Daniel Ricciardo over recent times, but actually the dynamic between the two just feels like there's a little bit of I don't know, disruption going on in there. There were a few radio calls that seemed a little bit angsty on both sides, desperate to get the other one out of the way. And look, I'm reading things between the lines. I have no major insight. I haven't actually spoken to anybody at the team about that specifically. But just reading between the lines, it just feels like there's a tiny little bit of unrest between the drivers. And that can never be a good thing. So I hope they can nip it in the bud. I hope it's not as bad as it might have seemed. And I hope they can get over it very quickly. Because there were flashes of performance in that car. So let's wait and see. They haven't been able to capitalise on how they finished last season. That's the most disappointing thing. They've been on this sort of steady rise back up towards the front of the grid. And then this year in 2022, they've kind of fallen off the cliff again a little bit. So Same thing we're talking about Mercedes. It's not just a quick and easy fix. You can't just throw money at the problem anymore. They have got a bit of a longer road to get that car back towards the front of the grid again. And look, you have to, as I said earlier, you've got to give a little bit of leeway to these teams because of what's happened in 2022. The biggest change to this sport, technically, that we've had in recent history. And whenever you get a massive shift like that, it's inevitable that some people will get things a tiny bit better or get a tiny bit close to being perfect than others. And what happens over years is that performance begins to converge over time. That's what will have happened over the past few years. That's why performance got better and better over the last few years, and teams could gradually evolve their car to something that delivered brilliant performance by the end of 2021. Now we're at the very, very beginning of a development cycle, and the order is always going to be a little bit shaken up, a little bit disturbed. It was even the intention of the rules to some extent. So we've got to take a 3 or a 5 year view on these 2022 regs and see how then teams are shaping up after that 3 year review, if you like. See how they've all done. Of course, you want to get it right first time, and we're talking about marginal differences in terms of the ones that got it really right, the Red Bulls, the Ferraris, and those that didn't. It's just it takes longer to recover those marginal differences than it might have done in years gone by. Aston Martin's potential, your thoughts? They clearly see greater potential in that car, which is why they have gone down the route of this green Red Bull type car. They've gone down a massive design change partway through the season because even if it didn't deliver immediate results last time out, they see greater potential in it in terms of its development potential. So absolutely, I believe that has potential. Sebastian Vettel drove a great weekend or a great race yesterday. I hope they can continue in that form. They continue pushing in the same degree. The results that we saw yesterday, or the performance that we saw in Baku, although Canada is a different circuit, it clearly has some of the similar characteristics in terms of long straights, low downforce, low drag, high speeds. The cars that excelled in Baku, many of those will excel again in Canada. Bumpy street circuit. If you were able to deal with all of those challenges in Baku, you're probably going to do quite well next time out in Canada as well. So, look, I think the immediate future, I guess, looks quite promising for Aston Martin, given that they did okay yesterday. Right, couple of minutes. Where are we going to go here? Yeah, drop us a little like if you don't mind. That would be great. Just on your way out, before you leave, drop a little like, please. I'd appreciate it. Remy says, hit that like button. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Right. Do you think Red Bull will favour Max again this year, even if Perez keeps up his quali performances? Yes, I do. As I touched on earlier, I think that's exactly what we saw yesterday. A very clear example of that. Yep. Rumour is that De Vries will replace Hamilton for Merckx because of Hamilton's back. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about that one. If Lewis Hamilton has a serious back injury, then absolutely won't be able to race. That is a fact. But I have a feeling Lewis will be back. It's a difficult one. Lewis isn't enjoying his racing right now, understandably. He's struggling in a car that's inherently difficult, but he's also struggling to get the best out of it, where his teammate is just consistently a little bit more comfortable. He's in the midfield, he's getting stuck in traffic, in races. It's not a nice place to be for a driver that's as accomplished as him and been used to running at the front and challenging for race wins and at least podiums, but even championships. It's a frustrating time in Lewis's career, so I can understand all of the things that he's doing and saying, his body language, his demeanour, his behaviours and his chat. I get the frustration. It must be incredibly hard. So I don't know if he'll be out in Canada or not. There is a potential chance that his back is a problem, and it may be that it's De Vries that steps in, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. And on that note, folks, it is 10 o'clock here in the UK. I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you so much. Please just smash that like button on the way out your door. I'd appreciate it. Go and check out the Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast. A brand new one dropped today. You can get it in any of the podcast stores. Check out my socials. There's links all over it. I'd appreciate it. And if you do listen to it, let me know what you think. I'd love that too. Have a brilliant time, guys, over the next week. Of course, we haven't got very long to wait for the next race. Only a few days to go, and we'll be out in Canada again for more of the same. Have a good one, folks. Ta-ra.